Hello, my name is Trace. I'm from the state of Kansas, within the United States. I would like to introduce to you this channel consisting of English with a subtitle.
The Tale of Mrs Tiggy Winkle by BEATRIX Potter, 1866 to 1943. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Lucy who lived on a farm called Littletown. She was a very good girl, but she had a habit of constantly losing her handkerchiefs. One day, little Lucy came into the farmyard, crying her eyes out. "I've lost my handkerchief, 3 handkerchiefs and a pinafore. Have you seen them, Tabby Kitten?" The kitten continued washing her white paws. So Lucy asked a speckled hen, "Sally Henny Penny, have you found 3 handkerchiefs?" But the speckled hen ran into the barn, clucking, "I go barefoot, barefoot, barefoot." Next, Lucy asked Cock Robin, who was perched on a twig. Cock Robin glanced sideways at her with his bright black eye, then flew over a stile and away. Lucy climbed onto the stile and looked up at the hill behind Littletown, a hill that seemed to stretch up into the clouds as if it had no end. Far up the hillside, she thought she saw some white objects spread out on the grass. Lucy scrambled up the hill as quickly as she could, her strong legs carrying her along a steep path. She kept climbing until Littletown was far below. She could have dropped a pebble down the chimney. Soon she reached a spring bubbling up from the hillside. Someone had placed a tin can on a stone to catch the water, but it was overflowing because the can was only as big as an egg cup. In the wet sand along the path there were footprints of a very small person. Lucy continued to run, keeping her eyes peeled. The path ended beneath a large rock. The grass was short and green, and there were clothes, but no handkerchiefs. But there was something else, a door set straight into the hillside. Inside someone was singing, "Lily white and clean ho, with little frills between ho, smooth and hot, rusty red spot. Never here been seen ho." Lucy knocked, once, twice, and interrupted the singing. A slightly nervous voice called out, "Who's there?" Lucy opened the door, and what do you think she found inside the hill? A neat, clean kitchen with a stone floor and wooden beams, just like any other farm kitchen. The only difference was that the ceiling was so low, her head nearly brushed against it, and everything inside, from the pots and pans to the furniture, was tiny. There was a warm, slightly singed smell in the air. At the table stood a short, stout figure, holding an iron and staring anxiously at Lucy. Her printed dress was tucked up, and she wore a large apron over her striped skirt. Her little black nose sniffed repeatedly, her eyes sparkling, and under her cap, where Lucy had yellow curls, this little person had prickles. "Who are you?" Lucy asked. "Have you seen my handkerchiefs?" The little person made a polite curtsy. "Oh yes, if you please. My name is Mrs Tiggy Winkle. I'm an excellent starcher." She then took something out of a clothes basket and spread it out on the ironing blanket. "What's that?" asked Lucy. "That's not my handkerchief." "Oh no, if you please. That's a little scarlet waistcoat belonging to Cock Robin," Mrs Tiggy Winkle replied. She ironed it, folded it neatly, and set it aside. Then she took something else off a clothes rack. "That isn't my pinafore, is it?" Lucy asked. "Oh no, if you please. That's a damask tablecloth belonging to Jenny Wren. Just look at how it's stained with currant wine. It's very difficult to wash," Mrs Tiggy Winkle said. Mrs Tiggy Winkle's nose went sniffle, sniffle, snuffle, and her eyes twinkled. She then fetched another hot iron from the fire. "There's one of my handkerchiefs," cried Lucy, "and there's my pinafore." Mrs. Tiggy Winkle ironed it, pressed it, and shook out the frills. "Oh, that looks wonderful," said Lucy. "And what are those long yellow things with fingers like gloves?" Lucy asked. "Oh, those are a pair of stockings belonging to Sally Henny Penny. Look how she's worn out the heels from scratching around the yard." "She'll be going barefoot very soon," said Mrs. Tiggy Winkle. "Why, there's another handkerchief, but it isn't mine. It's red," Lucy said. "Oh no, if you please. That one belongs to old Mrs. Rabbit, and it smelled so strongly of onions. I had to wash it separately, but I still can't get the smell out," Mrs. Tiggy Winkle replied. "That's another one of mine," Lucy said. "What are those funny little white things?" Lucy asked. "Oh, those are a pair of mittens belonging to Tabby Kitten. I just have to iron them. She washes them herself," Mrs. Tiggy Winkle explained. "There's my last handkerchief," Lucy exclaimed. "And what are you dipping into the basin of starch?" Lucy asked. "They're little shirt fronts belonging to Tom Titmouse. He's extremely particular about them," Mrs. Tiggy Winkle replied. "Now that I've finished my ironing, I'm going to air some clothes." "What are these soft, fluffy things?" Lucy asked. "Oh, those are woolly coats belonging to the little lambs at Gelgil," Mrs. Tiggy Winkle explained. "Can their jackets be taken off?" Lucy inquired. "Oh yes, if you please. Look at the sheep mark on the shoulder. Here's one marked for Gatesgarth, and 3 that are from Littletown. They're always marked when they are washed," said Mrs. Tiggy Winkle. She hung up all sorts and sizes of clothes, small brown coats for mice, a velvety black moleskin waistcoat, a red tailcoat without a tail that belonged to Squirrel Nutkin, a very shrunken blue jacket belonging to Peter Rabbit, and a petticoat that wasn't marked and had been lost in the wash. Finally, the basket was empty. Then Mrs. Tiggy Winkle made tea, 1 cup for herself and 1 for Lucy. They sat on a bench in front of the fire, glancing sideways at each other. Mrs. Tiggy Winkle's hand, holding the teacup, was very brown and deeply wrinkled from the soap suds. Her gown and cap were covered in hairpins, sticking out in all directions, so Lucy didn't want to sit too close. After they had finished tea, they bundled up the clothes. Lucy's pocket handkerchiefs were neatly folded inside her clean apron and secured with a silver safety pin. Then they refreshed the fire with turf, locked the door, and hid the key under the door sill. Then Lucy and Mrs. Tiggy Winkle trotted down the hill with the bundles of clothes. As they walked along the path, little animals emerged from the ferns to greet them. The first ones they met were Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Bunny. She gave them their clean clothes, and all of the little animals and birds were very grateful to dear Mrs. Tiggy Winkle. By the time they had reached the stile at the bottom of the hill, the only thing left to carry was Lucy's small bundle. Lucy scrambled up the stile with the bundle in her hand. She turned to say good night and thank the washerwoman, but what a surprise, Mrs. Tiggy Winkle hadn't waited for thanks or the payment. She was running up the hill. Where was her white frilled cap, her shawl, her gown, and her petticoat? And she had become so small, so brown, and covered in prickles. It turned out Mrs. Tiggy Winkle was actually a hedgehog.